I thought I'd give you a little bit more info on my background for this conversation. I graduated from college in 1987 and went a couple of years working in my chosen field after that. And that was kind of a run up into graduate school, which I began in 1989. So, living in Chicago, going to the University of Chicago, then working at the Field Museum, and then going to the zoology program at the University of Florida. After that, it was kind of a long run 3 years to get the master's, and then 5 years to get the PhD. And I earned the PhD in 1997. Okay, then I didn't do a postdoc. I worked for 1.5 years as a temporary prof. First at the little bit at the same university, and then for a year at the uh, Valdosta University in Georgia. Then I landed a position full time at DePaul University in Chicago, which was what I really wanted to do. And then I worked there until 2014 when I decided to step away from academia. Okay, so that's the long thing. The point is, from a certain perspective, it's a pretty good run. I mean, I went to college, did a thing, worked in the thing, did grad school in the thing, got a professor job without the postdoc step, which is an important consideration, and then stayed at the same school for a really long time, and all of these are sort of considered various professional successy things. Uh, Along the way, that's a whole lot of graduate students. I mean, an immense amount of graduate students. First of all, at the University of Chicago, I was kind of adopted by graduate students and became kind of a junior version of them in my last year or so there, and while I was working in the area. And then, of course, in grad school itself, I should point out that the University of Florida has a really big program. So I was used to programs with maybe 6 or 7 graduate students total in the whole department, and then going to one with 10 times that number. And so being there for 8 years as people cycled through that process and watching the people finish, when I came in over the next few years, and then watching people start as I was there, and then especially as I was finishing up, seeing new people come in. Then as a prof, being involved with this matters a lot because you are approving of graduate students' applications. You're seeing a ton of them. Well, all right, this is getting way too long, and I said it would be brief. I'm not saying this to brag. What matters is that what I'm going to talk about comes from a whole lot of observation. The first thing, and the most important thing, is that being a graduate student means being hired. If you're not working for the department or for somebody in it or something like it, then you're going to have to pay tuition. If you are, then all or most of your tuition is waived. And that's what you need. There is no such thing as just going to graduate school and paying for it. That's being a sucker. And not only that, but it's kind of a crappy situation. Nobody is going to care that you're there. Because you see, English graduate programs, even more than most, really are using their graduate students as a labor pool to teach basically, first year introductory level English classes. And they need 1 million people to do it. And so they're going to have 1 million people come in and be graduate students. And exactly what those people do with their lives after that is it is not of automatic interest to the department or to anyone in it. Well, that leads us then to the next question. Sure, you can go to graduate school. Plenty of places will take you as well as almost anyone else because they need those teachers in place. I'm not saying they're very committed to the teaching. The training of graduate students for teaching itself is pretty much nil. So you end up either liking it and getting good on it by trying to learn how to do it better through whatever resources you can find or groups you can find, or you basically stink and the classes stink. And either way, the tuition is paid by those students and the bodies were filling the seats. It sounds very cynical, but it is very brutal, in fact, and particularly for English and related fields, that is the desperate need of the departments. If they can't get those sections taught, then they aren't going to persist in a variety of administrative ways that are very important to them. Okay, so another consideration is that if they are, getting a lower number of graduate students, and then those graduate students teach more sections per person, then those graduate students have a certain chance of actually making enough to make their rent. The pay ain't great. On the other hand, if they have lots and lots of graduate students, then each one teaches one section and is paid pennies, and more importantly doesn't make enough or is on the books enough to count in an administrative way for things like benefits of any kind and stuff like that. So, bottom line, don't go to graduate school unless it carries employment by the department as a default. Don't be fooled by other offers that there are things you could do that might get you some kind of support. Now, the word support is very key in academia. Here, I'm giving it the meaning of pay, a paycheck. So, you want to go to a place where you are going to receive a paycheck because you will be working. And if you do happen upon one of those other means of funding, whatever they may be, then the minute that those either dry up or aren't available to you at a particular time, the paycheck is still there for the work they have available for you. If the department can't commit to that, don't go. A related point is that it's critical that at least somebody there cares. They know you're there. They are committed to your success. They're interested in what you do. They are looking down the road for you because they know that road a lot better than you do. And they are willing to influence others on your behalf. So without that, there is no point to graduate school at all. It is a medieval system. It's based on old school guilds. It's based on the kinds of connections that those guilds have. So you have apprenticeship and you have initiations and you have status levels that give you different access and different titles. And at each step, the whole question is whether the people who are senior to you are talking to each other about you, about what you're going to do next. It is very possible to go to graduate school and have none of that be happening. So even if you do go to a place where you are getting a paycheck because you get to work while you're there, even if you do go to such a place but you don't have this kind of relationship, you are cheap, and I mean cheapest labor. And you have a way, way, way better life serving the mocha to graduate school students at the campus bar than you would be as one of those graduate students. And I do not lie. I mean that in every imaginable way. So that's two considerations, and they're both critical. Let's work on that second one just a little bit. And what it means is that when you apply to a graduate school, you really should not just be applying to that program. You should be applying in light of a given person being there, and at least one. And that person or those people know that you are applying. This means that you need to have relationships with people beforehand. Now, I believe you are currently an undergraduate, and that actually is a pretty good situation. It's better than not being in any kind of program for this immediate purpose I'm about to talk about, which is that you should be now, and if you aren't, get on it, involved with graduate student level activities at the department of the type you're interested in, or anything as close as you can get. If that means now approaching a professor and saying, I'm talking about graduate school, I want to take this seriously, and I want to know what a graduate student does, and I want to know what these, what the tasks are. I want to know, who's doing those right here. What possible volunteer or employment status can I get so that I can be involved in that and be, literate basically in this profession. That's absolutely critical. Graduate school, as I say, is a medieval guild system. It is not school. It is a system of apprenticeship and employment and status shifts. You may well be taking some important classes and learn lots of things that you needed to know and didn't, but it's not school in that ordinary sense. So preparing for it just by being good at school is simply not going to do it. It's not the criterion that's going to be involved when people are interested in your welfare. And believe me, without that interest in your welfare, you are wasting your time even saying the words graduate school. So wherever you are, find professors who do shit you like, and or even if you don't even know, what do they do anyway? What do these people do when they're not in the classroom teaching you anyway? That's what you need to find out. And it's not a secret, they're just not used to students asking it. So you need to be one of those students who goes in and asks, and instead of saying, how can I get into grad school, which is kind of a needy and bluntly kind of ignorant way to put it, instead you would say, what do you do? What do the graduate students do? What work is this anyway? I mean, teaching students, is part of what you do, but what do you do? So these are the things you need to know and participate in, because the answer to those things is highly social. It is integrated with people across schools, not within them. So there's this shadow job that they have, which is their real job, that you never see particularly, that involves, crossing across all these universities in different countries even and stuff. And you need to be participating at that level, because that's how you learn, and that's how you know where you're going to apply. That's where you meet people and are recommended to people to talk to. And so when you apply to a graduate school, you should be applying because a person there knows who you are, is interested in your future, and is effectively committed to, you being there. Getting into the school, the graduate school, particularly as an English student, really isn't very hard. There are criteria. There are lots of ways to make a mistake and therefore not get in, but it's just a matter of not making those mistakes. More importantly is going there with any hope, and I mean a snowball's chance in hell hope of improving your life. And to do that, you need that social and professional commitment from others. Sort of a bad question to say, if I apply to your program, will I get in? That is crude. More important would be to say, would you support my application? Or even better, I'd love to learn more about your program. Let's talk about it. Because then you're treating them as a potential junior peer and saying, I'm participating in all of this, and I'm willing. They'll have different situations. Some professors will say, well, I can't. And that's actually kind of fair for them to say that. Some will say, well, I have a lot of graduate students right now, maybe in just a little while, and hopefully give you some suggestions about what you might do before applying a little bit later. And that's very good of them too, because they're basically optimizing, your chances. They have a very keen idea of what those empty teaching seats are going to be like for their program. So they have a really good idea of when it's a good time to apply and when it's not, just in terms of how many spaces the department needs to fill. Okay. Of course, then there are some who say, this is great. You seem great. We've been had these great conversations. I've read your stuff and go ahead and apply. I'm definitely, on board for when you show up. So those are all good things. Those people don't actually, say you get in, but their knowledge of you upon application does play a big role. Well, we can talk a little bit more about what life is like as a graduate student, but I don't think that is something I can really speak to for an English program. And schools are really, really different. They have different atmospheres, they have different working requirements, they have different relationships between graduate students and profs, and you're just going to have to assess that stuff yourself. What matters that I can provide to you is that this consideration that their commitment to your future is not something that just begins and stays steady. So you'll have to be attentive to whether the program is serving you properly through that kind of commitment or not. The curse of the English graduate student, as I have observed, is to not be committed to in this fashion. You are, serving your function as very, very inexpensive labor for teaching students, filling these seats in the first year classes, and that's what they want. So you have to kind of stay on that and develop these relationships as you're going and be involved in what you might think of as real academic work, so that you can say, I went to graduate school, and they'll say, what did you do except teach, that class 15 times? And you're like, well, I don't guess I didn't really do anything else. Well, you need to do something else. Find out what those things are. Oh, reminds me, one more thing. I mentioned my master's. The master's degree is a highly dodgy topic. It just so happens that the University of Florida, when I went there for my program in zoology, had a very highly regarded master's program, but it was in the minority. In many, many places, what getting a master's means is that they didn't give a shit about you. You taught there for a while, and it would make more sense for them to concentrate on someone else, and they got someone else, and you were done, and you get this thing called a master's. In many cases, in certain sciences or schools, to get a master's means that you failed the PhD. And it's called a booby prize and has no prestige at all. So I happen not to have a booby prize master's and went on to a PhD as well. But that was barely possible. It depended very much on the school back in 1992 when I got that master's. And now my understanding really is that a master's is not really something you should be shooting for. Now, I could be wrong, but you need to have very definite and observed evidence to the contrary, that for your school, for your degree, for your discipline, that a master's degree is worth anything. And if it's not, then bag it. Don't even look at it. Don't think about it. Don't strive for one. Don't be in a program that's going to give you one. Okay. What about that tunnel at the end of the tunnel, the PhD, and the associated or potentially associated position of being a faculty member somewhere? The possibility is that you, through your work and your interests and your activities, will actually not seek a faculty position. What that means for an English PhD or associated degree, whatever it's called, I'm not sure what that is, and you'll have to find out whether such things exist and what that's like, what the roads are to them while you're there, because there is no manual, and it's highly school specific as well. So I'm going to focus on what I did, because what I did was a little bit unusual in that I did not do a postdoctorate position. A postdoctorate position is basically a PhD job that is going to last for 1 year, and you are effectively a senior graduate student working for someone else. In the sciences, this is often considered a necessary step for success. I didn't do one. I became a professor right away. But what matters is to look at what it means to be a prof. Focusing on, well, you've heard of tenure. Historically, tenure and promotion are not the same thing. Tenure means legal protection against being wrongly fired or fired for, spurious reasons, and or even most reasons. And then promotion is what it sounds like, a pay upgrade and a change in title and different administrative duties and stuff like that. They are now, historically, they've become synonymous. And that means, first of all, that as a hired professor, you don't have tenure. You may already have known that, but the populace doesn't. And most people think that being a prof just means, oh, you have tenure, that's awesome. No, you don't. You won't have it unless you are promoted. Schools have learned, and they learned long ago, that they do quite well not to promote, that they flip professors, and that therefore, you don't promote this professor and then you hire a new one. And that way you don't upgrade salaries, and you don't sort of upset the apple cart of, the positioned professors, and you sort of very carefully control the very few who you are moving up that ladder. That's why you have positions that are designated now, either tenure track or non-tenure track, which is a euphemism for saying tenure track means that we are aiming you at promotion. Non-tenure track means you will not be under consideration for promotion at all. You will not. And that they will let you go. They just won't rehire you after a few years. This is dubiously legal, and has not yet been tested in court. I've been told, actually, by shamefaced department heads that they live in fear of that day, because they're pretty sure that this is standard practice across the United States, and that they're pretty sure it's not legal. And so you would, in this situation, need to understand that an entry-level professor position, either non-tenure track or tenure track, is not a high-paying job, and in many cases is quite poorly paid, with salaries in the sort of $30,000 a year range, and which is shocking to people. I mean, everyone's convinced that professors are, high-end white-collar earners, and they're not. Once you get promoted and work your way up this promotion ladder, then things start looking a lot rosier for status in society and also paychecks and stuff like that. But how many professors are we talking about? So I'm not talking about some meritocracy of people who make it to promotion and then the others who kind of flailed around and failed at it. I'm talking about people who are hired distinctly in the understanding that, absent some heinous act on their part, they're going to be promoted, and then everybody else who is not going to be under that consideration. Very much a two-tiered situation for academia. Back when I was first seeking professor work, what kind of proportions were we talking about? And those proportions were approaching the 50% mark of non-tenure track representation in academia and in faculty nationwide. This was considered kind of disastrous. What does that say about our profession that 50% of our positions are currently filled by people who are not under consideration for promotion and are guaranteed to have to walk, and if they're going to stay in the profession, have to start over doing exactly the same thing in some other school. And what's going to happen to these people in the long term? I mean, over 50%, that's crazy. Now, not approaching, over 80%. That's right. Only a small fraction of faculty members nationwide are under consideration for promotion and thus tenure. Everybody else is a temp, effectively. Full-time if they're lucky. because if they're not full-time, then they don't get these benefits like insurance and stuff. And many of them are part-time and may even be working at multiple institutions, which is an incredibly wretched life. So at that point, you are making such pennies and living such a stressful existence, basically dashing from classroom to classroom, that what I said about the barista is absolutely correct. These people's quality of life and their paychecks, their circumstances of life are vastly inferior to the people who are serving them mocha. And there is no joke there. So, therefore, your thoughts on what to do as a graduate student are very important, but also what does that mean in terms of what you want to do? Do you really want to be in the running, bearing in mind that you could have an extremely superior performance as a PhD candidate, and then you're thrown into this job situation that I've talked about, and you, regardless of merit, are very much up against hiring practices and a job situation which is completely uninterested in how good you are at it. They're much more interested. I mean, there's this huge belief in academia that it's a meritocracy. It's a deeply rooted belief and is somewhat characteristic of people who have gone through a more stochastic process, which is to say, rolling dice, and then, of course, landing where they are, say, well, of course, it's a meritocracy. So, therefore, I strongly recommend knowing what you're up against and looking ahead and deciding what it is you want to do for you. There is no system in place either to get into graduate school, to be in graduate school, or to emerge from graduate school for your benefit. You have to make and shape the arrangements for it so that they are for your benefit. Bearing in mind that particularly for people coming in an English program for a degree and people being hired to an English program as faculty, that the system in question is really committed to keeping you cheap and in the flip situation. So therefore you must look to each circumstance and make sure that you are not in that position. Otherwise, you really should be on the other side of that coffee counter. Well, I'm hoping that's somewhat helpful and didn't tell you just stuff you already knew. If you have any other questions, or if it seems to you like something I said needs questions answered, just let me know.